A sentence as sharp as a knife sliced through the air, making the atmosphere suddenly thick, suffocating. Ethan Caldwell stood in the middle of the room, bathed in the glow of the lights, his sharp eyes fixed on Sophia, the waitress holding a tray in her hands. "If you worked for me, you'd already be fired." His cold words not only silenced the room, but also made everyone's heart stop. Every gaze was now fixed on her. In that moment, everything seemed frozen. Sophia, 28 years old, stood motionless, her hands trembling with tension, her throat choking. Cold sweat beaded on her forehead, but she dared not show any sign of weakness. The eyes of every customer in the restaurant no longer looked at Ethan, but at her, waiting and scrutinizing to see how she would react to this humiliation. It was a place full of power and arrogance, where people like her were just shadows, not worth a second glance. In the shadows, Jackson stood there, his eyes never leaving Sophia. Though he said nothing, his gaze held pain and sympathy. The people around her looked at her with pity, but no one dared to stand up. No one dared to speak out in her defense. She could only stand strong, facing the raging storm of life alone. Sophia's difficult days came rushing back to her memory. She was a single mother, living in a cramped apartment in Queens, where sunlight rarely reached through the windows. She always tried to give her daughter Kiki a better life. Even on the most tiring days after working non-stop from morning until night, Sophia remained determined to keep her daughter's dream alive. She dreamed of a day when Kiki would stand on stage, a talented dancer, not just spinning around in small rooms with worn-out clothes. Every penny she earned, no matter how little, went into a pink piggy bank with the words "Dance Dreams" scrawled on it. It was a promise she made to her daughter, a promise of a brighter future. Every time Kiki looked at her with hopeful eyes, Sophia was more convinced of her belief that everything she did was for her daughter to be able to fly higher and go farther. But today, standing before Ethan's cold stare, everything Sophia had fought for, everything she had sacrificed, suddenly felt more fragile than ever. She was just a waitress in this restaurant, someone who had to bow her head and endure harsh words from those in power. But deep down, Sophia still hadn't lost her dignity. She would not let anyone, no matter who they were, take away her self-respect. When Ethan's voice echoed, sharp as a knife, splitting the air, everything in the room went silent. The sound of dishes breaking lightly, then quickly fading away. Glasses stopped touching lips, and the piano ceased to play. The entire room became heavy with silence, as though time had paused, leaving only Ethan's cold presence. Sophia, still holding the tray tightly, stood motionless. Her heart pounded in her chest, feeling as if she were suffocating, trapped in a closed room with no way out. Every gaze from the customers, from the people sitting at nearby tables, was fixed on her, waiting for a reaction. But all she could do was stand still, her eyes cast downward, too afraid to meet their stares. It wasn't because she was scared, but because, in that moment, she realized that silence was the only way for her to maintain her self-respect. She had endured too much, but if she let herself fall now, there would be nothing left to protect. And even though it hurt, she still refused to let someone like Ethan Caldwell, someone who saw himself as the center of the universe, defeat her. Sophia turned away, trying to keep her steps steady, her hands no longer trembling. Though her heart was filled with a storm of emotions, she knew that in moments like this, resilience was not about showing others, but about standing firm with herself. A fleeting image appeared in her mind, her sitting at the dinner table in her small apartment, with Kiki dancing around her, the little girl's skirt twirling in the dim light. Kiki, with her bright eyes full of hope, always believed that one day she would stand on stage, wearing a beautiful dress and white ballet shoes, just like the fairy tales Sophia always told her. In every move her daughter made, Sophia saw the belief in the future, in the dream. And it was that dream, it was Kiki that kept her standing strong, even though everything around her was unjust, drowning her in waves of humiliation. And today in this fancy restaurant, where everyone only saw a simple waitress, she was not the only one feeling that humiliation. The people around her, from the strangers at the tables to her colleagues, all watched. Some showed pity, others turned away, unwilling to get involved in whatever was happening. She knew that if she let this silence consume her, she would be the one to lose. But a part of her couldn't speak out, couldn't resist that unfair treatment. She was a mother, and no matter what, she still had to keep living, to stay strong for Kiki, for her daughter's dream. One thing she knew for certain, she would not let anyone, not even Ethan Caldwell, steal her daughter's dream. She would fight with her silence and her courage until that dream became a reality. In the silence, when everything seemed to stop, Sophia felt the pain in her heart rise. She could feel Ethan's cold gaze, like a knife wound cutting deep into her self-esteem. But the more she felt that, the more she realized something. If she let herself fall now, it wouldn't just be her who would fail, but also Kiki's dream. As she turned away, keeping her steps steady, her breath became heavier. In moments like this, what must a mother do to protect her child? What must she do to defend her child's dream when the world is so unfair? The only answer that resounded in Sophia's heart was, "Don't give up." Sophia had endured so much. The sleepless nights, the sacrifices no one could see, the sweat and tears no one knew about. She had done everything for Kiki, but now she was facing a struggle that wasn't just for her daughter, it was for herself too. Her choice wasn't just going to affect her and Kiki, it could change the way she saw the world around her. When she returned to Ethan's table, she still maintained a stiff smile, but inside her resilience was stronger than ever. She could feel the injustice surrounding her, but she knew that without determination, there would be nothing left. She not only had to protect Kiki's dream, but also protect her own dignity. Each step she took, although steady, carried an overwhelming weight. She couldn't let herself be weak in this moment. Everyone was watching her, and in their eyes she could see pity, fear, even indifference. But the truth was, she wouldn't let herself become a victim in this story. Her footsteps brought her closer to Ethan's table. She knew there would be no reception from him. She knew he would never see her as a person, but only as a tool to use. But Sophia, despite the anger burning inside her, found a different strength in her gaze. That strange calmness was the strength she had been seeking. When she placed the dish in front of Ethan, there were no apologies, no bowing down. She simply did her job perfectly, knowing that respect wasn't something you could buy with money. And this time, she chose not to let the humiliation consume her. Sophia didn't need to say anything more. Every step she took, though simple, was full of strength. She had decided that she wouldn't stay silent anymore. She wasn't just here for this job, but for what she truly deserved: respect and a place where she didn't have to work in constant shame and contempt. In that moment, the whole room seemed to stop breathing. The eyes that once looked at her as a mere servant no longer saw her that way. They now saw a woman who wasn't just doing her job, but someone who stood as a symbol of quiet strength. Although Ethan still didn't look at her, Sophia knew one thing: she was no longer invisible. Kiki's dream was no longer something distant. She could see the light at the end of the tunnel. And that light didn't come from wealth, power, or anyone in the room. It came from her, the woman who refused to bow down to adversity. Never had Sophia felt that this moment was more important than now. Although she had tried to maintain her composure, each step she took, each breath, each time she reached for the trays, made one thing clearer. She could no longer live under the shadow of silence and submission. She could no longer be a part of this cruel system where dreams were crushed under the feet of power. As she turned back to Ethan's table, her heart sank. Everything she had endured up until now, the insults, the isolation, the cold stares, felt like an underground wave crashing into her heart. But this time, she didn't feel weak. She felt a new strength rising from within. Sophia took a deep breath and placed the tray on Ethan's table with an astonishing calmness. She no longer apologized, didn't ask for forgiveness. She simply stood there facing him, with silence but with firmness. Her eyes locked with his, unwavering, not bowing, not humble, but a defiant gaze, one she had never dared face before. And in that moment she realized, no one had the right to take away her dignity unless she agreed to let them. Ethan didn't look at her. He kept his focus on his phone, pretending to ignore her presence. But Sophia knew that he couldn't ignore the change in the atmosphere. The sweat dripping from her forehead wasn't from fear, but from the tension of the battle she was fighting within herself. And then, that moment came. Another server walked by and muttered softly, "She'll probably get fired." The words rang out like a warning bell. The gossip, the condescending glances, all seemed to pull her into the quicksand of failure. But in that moment, Sophia made a decision. She wouldn't let herself fall into that pit anymore. From deep within, a voice rose, not from the outside, but from within her own heart. If I don't stand up for myself, who will? It was a question she had to answer, not just for herself, but for Kiki, her daughter, who always believed in her mother, who always believed that one day she would be able to escape poverty and live in a world full of light and hope. She knew that if she gave up, Kiki's dreams would fade, and that would be an unforgivable failure. Not just for Kiki, but for herself. So she chose to stand firm, not just to protect her daughter, but to protect her own dignity and belief in herself. As she continued walking through the dining room, no longer feeling alone, no longer feeling dismissed, she realized that she was no longer just serving customers. She was serving herself, serving her resilience and the respect she had regained from within. She had decided not to remain silent anymore. She had found her voice, though it was small, yet powerful and full of determination. And Sophia realized in that moment that it wasn't power or money that truly mattered in life. It was the ability to stand firm in the face of difficulty, the ability to preserve one's dignity, and the ability to love without succumbing to anything. The atmosphere in the restaurant had become more stifling than ever. Each second that passed, the whispers from the dining tables grew silent, leaving only the sound of utensils clinking and the sighs of the staff. Everyone realized something was happening, something they could no longer ignore, something they couldn't stay silent about. Sophia was no longer just an ordinary waitress. She had become a symbol of resistance, of dignity being violated, and now she stood firm amidst all the pressure. The glances around her were no longer filled with contempt. They began to look at her with respect. Though no one spoke, in their hearts, they understood that she had done something no one else dared to do. She had stood up. As the applause started, it began with a soft clap from the corner of the room, and gradually it spread throughout the entire space. It wouldn't stop. This time, no one bowed their head. No one turned away. Each clap, each round of applause was like a beat in her heart, a confirmation that she was no longer just a server in that room. She was a woman with a strength that even the most powerful people couldn't suppress. Jackson stood at a distance, watching Sophia with a completely different look than before. Something inside him had shifted, a strange, powerful feeling. He could feel her strength, the resilience in her eyes, and he knew this was the crucial moment. This wasn't just a change in Sophia, it was a change in everyone in that room. Those who had once been silent, those who had bowed their heads, those who had been shadows in the system. When the crowd began to cheer, Jackson knew this change couldn't stop here. This wasn't just a simple act of defiance. It was a movement, a wake-up call that everyone needed to feel. He saw the light in the eyes of the other staff, those who had bowed their heads before, now standing tall, more confident. As for Sophia, she didn't feel joy or pride from the applause. She didn't need validation from the people around her. What she needed was to know that she had done the right thing, that she had stood up when no one else would. She had protected her own dignity and that of her daughter, and that was all she needed. She looked toward the door, where a dim light was shining through. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew that a turning point had truly occurred. Tonight, it wasn't just one person who had been seen. Everyone who had been ignored in that system now had the chance to be seen. They no longer had to live in fear and silence. Sophia turned back, and in her heart, a small yet powerful hope rose. She wasn't alone anymore. She felt connected to those around her, those who had been fighting in silence all this time. She smiled softly, not because of the victory, but because the truth had been brought into the light. This was just the beginning. The scene in the restaurant at that moment was unforgettable. The applause did not cease, and it was not just for Sophia, but also a confirmation from the entire community. A silent bond formed between everyone in the room. Anyone present could understand that what they had just witnessed was not a personal struggle. It was a fight for fairness and respect. This was the moment when the values of human dignity, courage, and resilience were no longer expressed through words, but through actions. Every glance, every smile, whether small or unnoticed, carried with it a promise that no one would remain silent when faced with injustice. Jackson stood still, his hands relaxed, watching the crowd applauding. Part of him felt relief, but another part of him kept reflecting on what had just transpired. He knew that this couldn't end with a simple action like this. The fight wasn't over, but today she had changed everything. As a CEO, Jackson knew that change didn't always come from grand decisions or powerful actions. Sometimes change began with small things, the kind of breakthrough that no one expected. And that's exactly what Sophia had done. She didn't wait for anyone to help her. She didn't wait for change from the top. She created that change herself, even at a great personal cost. As the applause began to die down, Jackson walked towards Sophia, his steps light on the polished floor. She looked up at him, her eyes hesitant, but deep within them, there was a light that no one had ever noticed before. "Sophia," Jackson spoke gently, but enough to capture everyone's attention. "You've done the unthinkable. But what's even more important is that you've shown everyone that dignity and respect are not things that can be bought. They have to be earned with persistence and courage." Sophia looked at him, a warm feeling rising in her chest. She could sense his understanding in his gaze, a feeling that she was no longer alone in this fight. She smiled weakly, her tears still not fully dry. But this time, they weren't tears of shame or disappointment. They were tears of relief and hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked but full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done this alone." The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. The staff no longer glanced at each other with secrecy. They looked at Sophia, and their gazes had transformed. They no longer saw her as just a colleague, but as a role model. A role model of persistence, of someone who wouldn't give up, even when the world was unjust. Everything had become clearer than ever. The staff members no longer avoided eye contact or whispered behind each other's backs. They began to discuss what had happened. Some had seen the light in Sophia's actions, and some couldn't help but speak words of praise, even though they might never have imagined doing so before. A co-worker approached Sophia, placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you. You've taught us the most valuable lesson in life. Never let anyone take away your dignity." Sophia smiled gently. She didn't need to say anything more. Every word, every gesture in this moment held deep meaning. She knew that she had won, not just in her personal fight, but for everyone who had always been silent, who had always endured and never had a voice. Life was never easy, but at this moment, Sophia felt that everything she had been through, all the struggles and hardships, had a purpose. And that purpose was for her to stand strong, to become an inspiration for others, just as the people around her had done for her over the past time. The atmosphere in the restaurant had shifted, no longer tense like before. The applause hadn't stopped, but now it wasn't just for Sophia. It was a declaration from the entire community, an invisible bond among everyone in the room. Anyone who was present understood that what they had witnessed wasn't just a personal struggle, it was a fight for fairness and respect. This was the moment when the values of human dignity, courage, and resilience weren't just shown through words, but through action. Every glance, every smile, whether subtle or unnoticed, held a promise that no one would remain silent when confronted with injustice. Jackson stood still, his hands relaxed, observing the crowd applauding. Part of him felt comforted, but another part of him continued to reflect on what had just happened. He knew that this couldn't end with just one action. The battle wasn't over, but today she had changed everything. As a CEO, Jackson understood that real change doesn't always come from big decisions or powerful moves. Sometimes change begins with small, unexpected actions. And that's exactly what Sophia had done. She didn't wait for anyone to help her. She didn't wait for change to come from above. She created that change herself, even at a great personal cost. As the applause gradually died down, Jackson walked towards Sophia, his steps soft on the polished floor. She looked up at him, her eyes hesitant, but in them he saw a light that had never been there before. "Sophia," Jackson said gently, but his voice was firm enough to capture the attention of everyone. "You've done the unthinkable, but more importantly, you've shown everyone that dignity and respect are not things you can buy. They must be earned with persistence and courage." Sophia looked at him, feeling a wave of warmth rise within her. She sensed his understanding in his gaze, and she knew she was no longer alone in this fight. She smiled weakly, her tears not yet fully dried, but this time, they weren't tears of shame or disappointment. They were tears of release and hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice choked but filled with gratitude. "I couldn't have done this alone." The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The staff no longer exchanged secretive glances. They looked at Sophia, and their gazes had changed. They didn't see her as just a coworker anymore. They saw her as a role model of persistence, someone who wouldn't give up, even when the world was unjust. Everything was clearer than ever. The staff no longer avoided each other's eyes or whispered behind each other's backs. They began discussing what had happened. Some saw the light in Sophia's actions, while others couldn't help but speak words of praise, even though they might have never thought they'd do so. A co-worker approached Sophia, placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you. You've taught us the most valuable lesson in life. Never let anyone take away your dignity." Sophia smiled softly. She didn't need to say anything else. Every word, every gesture in this moment held profound meaning. She knew she had won, not just in her own battle, but for everyone who had always been silent, always endured, and never had a voice. Life was never easy, but at this moment, Sophia felt that everything she had gone through, all the struggles and hardships, had a reason. And that reason was so she could stand firm, to be an inspiration for others, just as the people around her had done for her all this time. As everything settled down, the atmosphere in the restaurant returned to a calm, but the change was unmistakable. It wasn't a change brought about by persuasive words or grand gestures. It was a change sown from the smallest moments, from steady steps taken even on a road full of thorns. Sophia hadn't just fought for herself, she had fought for values that few could see through the fancy clothes or the sparkling glasses. As the applause gradually ceased, a strange yet comforting feeling spread throughout the space. It was as though something had been released, like everyone could finally breathe again after a long, suffocating silence. Jackson stood still, looking at everything around him, but his mind kept circling back to what had just happened. He knew it couldn't stop with one simple act. This was only the beginning of something greater. "We won't let this go to waste," Jackson thought to himself. That feeling didn't come only from anger over what Sophia had endured, but also from the clear realization that life wasn't just about assets or power. What truly mattered were the values of respect, dignity, and courage. Jackson had witnessed many challenges in his company, from difficult decisions to moments of dishonesty in the business world. But now he realized that real change couldn't always come from monumental events. Sometimes it started from the smallest things. It began with a single word, a courageous action, and people like Sophia. In the quiet of the room, Jackson stood up and walked toward Sophia, his steps steady on the shiny floor. She looked up at him, hesitant, but in her eyes there was a light no one had seen before. "Sophia," Jackson said softly, but his voice was strong enough to grab everyone's attention. "You've done the unthinkable, but more importantly, you've shown everyone that dignity and respect aren't things that can be bought. They have to be earned through persistence and courage." Sophia looked at him, warmth rising in her chest. She felt his understanding in his gaze, a feeling that she wasn't alone anymore. She gave a weak smile, her tears still not fully dried. But this time, they weren't tears of shame or disappointment. They were tears of release and hope. "Thank you," she said, her voice cracking but full of gratitude. "I couldn't have done this alone." The atmosphere in the room had completely transformed. The staff no longer exchanged secretive looks. They looked at Sophia, and their gazes had shifted. They no longer saw her as just a colleague. They saw her as a role model of persistence, someone who wouldn't give up, even when the world treated her unfairly. Everything was clearer than ever. The staff no longer avoided eye contact or whispered behind one another's backs. They began discussing what had happened. Some of them saw the light in Sophia's actions, and some couldn't help but speak words of praise, even though they never thought they would do so. A co-worker walked up to Sophia, placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered, "Thank you. You've taught us the most valuable lesson in life. Never let anyone take away your dignity." Sophia smiled softly. She didn't need to say anything more. Every word, every gesture in that moment carried deep meaning. She knew she had won, not just in her own personal battle, but for everyone who had been silent, endured, and never had a voice. Life wasn't easy, but at that moment, Sophia felt that everything she had been through, every struggle, every hardship, had a purpose. And that purpose was to help her stand strong and become an inspiration for others, just as the people around her had been for her. Thank you for following this story with us. If you found this video inspiring or it helped you see life in a new light, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss any exciting and meaningful videos in the future. Thank you again, and we'll see you in the next videos. Wishing you strength and confidence on your journey.